"She is not on the list," the woman said, her voice smooth as polished bone. Cassiel Ashvale stood at the center of the grand hall, her golden hair arranged in elaborate coils that caught the firelight like a crown she had already decided to claim. She did not look at Lyra when she spoke. She never looked at Lyra. That was the point. She was never meant to be here. This is a mistake. The silence that followed pressed down on every person in the room. Lyra felt it on her shoulders, in her alve, chest, behind her eyes where tears were absolutely not going to form, because she had promised herself, years ago in a cold corridor, with a bruised knee and no one coming to help, that she would not give any of them the satisfaction. She stood still. She had learned stillness the way some girls learn dancing, the way others learn embroidery, through practice and pain, and the understanding that movement drew attention, and attention was never kind. But tonight, stillness was not enough. Tonight, the world had decided to see her whether she wanted it to or not. The great hall of the Ashvale estate was filled with people who mattered. Every eligible daughter of the northern clans had been primped and polished, and presented for this evening, the most significant gathering in 3 generations. The Alpha King was choosing. Not just any Alpha King, but Alphonse Drakkar, ruler of the Lycan territories of the far north, whose name alone was enough to make grown warriors lower their eyes. He had arrived at nightfall with a retinue of 12 guards, all of them enormous, all of them silent, all of them radiating the kind of contained power that made the air feel thicker just by proximity. The Alpha King himself had said almost nothing since his arrival. He had walked through the doors, assessed the room in a single sweeping glance, and taken his seat at the head of the ceremonial table with the economy of movement that spoke not of laziness, but of absolute certainty. He had no need for performance. He simply was, and everything else arranged itself accordingly. Lyra had not expected to be in this hall at all. She had not been invited, not precisely. She had come because the head housekeeper, old Marin with her arthritic hands and her unfailing sense of fairness, had pressed a cleaned and mended dress into Lyra's arms 3 hours before the gathering and said, "You have as much right as any of them, girl. More, perhaps. Do not let them tell you otherwise." Marin did not know what she was talking about, not really. No one did. But Lyra had put on the dress, which was pale gray and simple but clean, and she had braided her dark hair herself, and she had come to the hall and stood in the back, near the pillar where the light did not quite reach, and she had thought that perhaps no one would notice her at all. She had been wrong about that. She was wrong about so many things tonight. The Serpent was what had changed everything. The Serpent of Ashvale, the Great Ice. Sculpture that dominated the far wall of the ceremonial hall, had stood in that spot for longer than anyone could remember. It was ancient beyond reckoning, carved from a single block of glacial ice that never melted, never clouded, never lost its translucent perfection. The scholars said it was not carved at all but grown, shaped by magic older than the clans themselves, and that it served as a kind of spiritual marker for the bloodline that had built this hall and this legacy. It was beautiful, and cold and utterly still, and everyone in the room had long since stopped truly seeing it the way you stop seeing a wall you have walked past 10,000 times. Until it moved. Until it turned its great serpentine head, slow and deliberate, and impossibly graceful, and oriented itself not toward the Alpha King, not toward Cassiel, not toward any of the primped and polished daughters who had been offered like gifts to a conqueror. It turned toward the pillar where the light did not quite reach. It turned toward Lyra, and then, in a motion that no one in the room had words for, it bowed. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The sound that went through the assembled crowd was not a gasp. It was something older and more primal than a gasp. A collective exhale of breath that had been held without anyone realizing they were holding it, released all at once when the world shifted in a way that the Body understood before the mind could catch up. Lyra herself did not make a sound. She was frozen, which was perhaps appropriate given what was happening, her hands at her sides, her eyes fixed on the great ice creature whose cold gaze met hers with something that felt disturbingly like recognition. The serpent held its bowed position for a long moment. Then it straightened, returned to stillness, and the hall erupted. Cassiel's voice cut through the noise first because Cassiel had trained her. Voice the way a swordsman trains his blade, sharp and precise and capable of drawing blood. "This is manipulation," she said. "This is a trick. She has done something, used some stolen knowledge, or found some mechanism to make it appear as though." She stopped because the Alpha King had raised one hand, not in an emphatic gesture but in the absolute minimum motion required to produce silence, and silence was what he received instantly and completely. He was looking at Lyra now. She felt it. Before she saw it, the weight of his attention like a change in atmospheric pressure. And when she finally allowed herself to meet his gaze, she understood for the first time what people meant when they spoke of the King of the North as a man who had turned himself into something other than human through sheer force of will. His eyes were pale, nearly colorless in the firelight, the kind of gray that exists between ice and sky on a winter morning when there is no horizon. They were not warm, but they were, in this moment, utterly and entirely focused on her, and there was something in that focus that was more unnerving than anything Cassiel or anyone else had ever aimed in her direction. "Come here," he said. Not loud, not a shout. He simply said the words, and they arrived in Lyra's ears as clearly as if he had whispered them directly against her skin, and her feet moved before she had consciously decided to move them. She walked out from behind the pillar. She walked across the floor of the hall that she had spent years scrubbing on her hands and knees. She walked past the daughters of clans, past their polished faces and their careful expressions that could not quite hide the shock underneath, past Cassiel, whose beauty had sharpened itself into something that could cut, and she stopped 3 feet from the Alpha King's table because some instinct told her that was the appropriate distance, and she was not sure her legs would carry her any closer. "Your name," he said. "Lyra," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was quietly and privately very proud of that. "Lyra Ashvale." She paused, then corrected herself with the honesty that had always been simultaneously her greatest virtue and the thing most likely to get her in trouble. "Lyra. I was given the Ashvale name when I was brought here as a child. I do not know if it belongs to me." He studied her for a moment that stretched considerably longer than comfort permitted. "You do not know your bloodline," he said. "And" was not a question. "No," she said. "I was told my parents died before I was old enough to remember. I was told very little." Something shifted in his expression then. Something so slight that she would later question whether she had seen it at all. A fractional tightening around his eyes. A thought crossing behind that pale gaze and disappearing before she could read it. "The serpent knows," he said. "It has not moved in 400 years. It was bound to the blood of a specific line and instructed to wait." He looked at her for one more moment in that devastating silence. "It has been waiting for you." The night that followed was the strangest of Lyra's life, and her life had not been short on strangeness. She was not dismissed. She was not sent back to the shadows. She was, to her profound discomfort and Cassiel's barely contained fury, installed in one of the guest rooms of the Ashvale estate's upper floor, alongside the legitimate daughters of the clan, given a proper meal by a wide-eyed kitchen girl who kept glancing at her as though expecting something supernatural to happen at any moment, and told by one of the Alpha King's 12 silent guards that her presence was required at the formal evaluation the following morning. Lyra sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and tried to process what had happened to her day. She had expected to spend this evening invisible, to perhaps steal a good look at the legendary Alpha King from her spot behind the pillar, to carry the memory of that glimpsed power back to her small room on the servants' corridor. and let it be a story she told herself in the dark. Instead, the world had rearranged itself around her in ways she did not understand and could not yet trust, because in Lyra's experience, good things that arrived without warning had a way of revealing their teeth eventually. She was thinking this, sitting in the dark, because she had not yet located the lamp and had not wanted to ask when. The knock came at her door. It was not the knock of a servant. It was precise and measured, 3 beats, not tentative but not aggressive either. The knock of someone who expected to be heard and was not accustomed to not being let in. She opened the door and found not the Alpha King, whom she had half expected and was entirely unprepared for, but a woman she had not seen before, perhaps 40 years of age with silver threading through dark hair, and the kind of face that had once been conventionally beautiful and had become interesting instead, which was the better outcome. She wore the colors of the Drakkar household and carried herself with the authority of someone who served by choice. "My name is Sable," the woman said. "I am the king's senior advisor. He has asked me to speak with you privately. May I come in?" Lyra stepped back. It was not quite an invitation, but it was not a refusal either. Sable sat in the room's single chair without being asked, which suggested she was the sort of person who made herself comfortable in spaces that were not hers as a matter of practice. She looked at Lyra steadily, without the assessment that the gathered daughters had been subjected to all evening, without any particular agenda that Lyra could read. "The king does not have time for what people expect of him," Sable said by way of beginning. "He is not sentimental. He is not playing a game with tonight's events. The Serpent's recognition means something specific, and he is acting on that information because it is his nature to act and not to wait." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I am going to tell you, I am telling you with his knowledge and consent, because he believes you deserve to understand your situation, rather than simply being moved through it like a piece on a board." Lyra sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She was good at waiting. "The bloodline the Serpent recognized," Sable said, "is the line of the Winter Sovereigns, the first rulers of the Lycan territories, who held the North before the current clan system was established. They were believed to have died out 4 centuries ago when the last known sovereign disappeared without an heir. The Serpent was bound to their blood as a record keeper and as a signal, so that if the line ever surfaced again, it would be known." She paused. "You are not merely of that blood. The strength of the Serpent's recognition suggests you are a direct descendant, not a distant one. The power is very close." Lyra was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the grounds of the Ashvale estate were dark and quiet, and the stars above them were extraordinarily numerous, the way they only were this far north, where the sky had not learned to accommodate human light. "I do not feel powerful," she said at last. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said all evening. Sable's mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "They never do," she said. "Until they do. The wolf comes when it is ready. The power comes when it is called. Both are currently asleep inside you, and both will wake." She stood. "Get some rest. Tomorrow the evaluation will proceed as planned. The king is fair, but he is thorough. He will not simply hand you anything because of tonight. You will be assessed alongside the others, and you will be expected to show yourself." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Cassiel Ashvale has spent 5 years preparing for this selection. She has alliances, and she has resources, and she is genuinely intelligent, which makes her considerably more dangerous than she appears. Do not underestimate her." She left without waiting for a response, which struck Lyra as characteristic of the household she represented. Lyra lay down in the strange bed and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a very long time. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The formal evaluation, the next morning, took place in the ceremonial garden, a vast space behind the estate that Lyra had spent considerable portions of her life maintaining on her hands and knees. She knew every stone path and every pruned hedge, and every fountain's particular sound better than she knew her own face. She had never stood in it as anything other than the girl who swept the leaves. Today she stood in it, wearing a borrowed dress that fit imperfectly, because no one had expected her to need one. And she watched the Alpha King move through the space with his 12 guards arranged at respectful distance, and she tried to understand what she was supposed to be doing. The evaluation was informal in structure, but not in significance. Alphonse Drakkar spent time with each candidate in turn. Perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps 30, enough time to speak and to listen and to form whatever impressions he was forming in that interior place that showed nothing on his face. He was not unkind. She could see that from a distance. He was not performing any particular warmth either, but he listened when the women spoke, and he asked questions that suggested he had heard the answers. Cassiel spoke with him longest of all, which was expected. Cassiel had prepared for this, the way military commanders prepare for battles, with attention to terrain and timing, and the deployment of specific weapons at specific moments. She was stunning in the morning light, her golden hair loose, and her emerald dress, precisely chosen to make her look like something precious and rare. She made the Alpha King laugh once, and the sound of it was so unexpected that several people nearby turned to look. Lyra noticed that the laughter did not reach his eyes. When he reached her, she was standing near the fountain she had cleaned 3 days ago, and she thought irrelevantly that she could see a spot she had missed on the stone basin to her left. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before, with that full and undivided attention that felt nothing like being examined and entirely like being seen, which were different things in ways she was still working out. "You are uncomfortable," he said. It was an observation, not a complaint. "Yes," she said, because lying to him seemed both impossible and pointless. "I do not know the rules of this." He tilted his head very slightly. A small motion that she was beginning to understand was his version of a raised eyebrow. "Neither do I," he said. "The Serpent changed them." He paused. "Tell me about yourself." She looked at him. "There is not very much to tell," she said carefully. "I grew up here. I worked here. I do not have a formal education or a clan position or any of the things the other women being evaluated today have. I do not know what I am supposed to offer you." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not ask what you could offer," he said. "I asked who you are." The distinction hit her somewhere in the sternum. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything, turning it over and examining it before she committed to it. "I am someone who learned to be invisible," she said at last. "And I am not certain yet whether that was wisdom or surrender." His expression did not change, but something in the space between them shifted, the way the air shifts before weather arrives. "That," he said quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this entire territory." He stood there for a moment longer than his conversations with the other women had lasted, and she was aware of the watching eyes, of Cassiel's particular quality of stillness from across the garden, the kind of stillness that was the opposite of peace. Then he inclined his head, a small but formal acknowledgement, and moved on. Lyra was still standing by the fountain when Cassiel found her 30 minutes later. The golden woman moved with the precision of someone who had planned this interception, who had positioned herself and waited for the right moment, and there was something almost admirable about the execution of it, even as every instinct Lyra had ever developed went quietly and urgently on alert. "You understand," Cassiel said, without preamble, in a voice low enough that only Lyra could hear, "that what happened last night means nothing." She stood close enough that Lyra could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that was weaponized as surely as anything carried in a scabbard. An old piece of ice moved. People who have never read a history book are calling it miraculous. The king is thorough, and he will investigate because it is his nature. But when the investigation concludes, It will conclude that there is no substantive bloodline claim, and you will go back to whatever corner you have been occupying, while the rest of us continue with the actual process." She smiled, and it was a beautiful smile, and it contained about as much warmth as the sculpture in the hall behind them. "I am telling you this not out of cruelty but out of genuine kindness, because it would be a shame to watch you humiliate yourself by hoping for something that is not going to happen." Lyra looked at her for a long moment. She had been looked at with contempt by this woman for most of her conscious life, and she knew every variation of it: the dismissive glance, the cold shoulder, the pointed exclusion from anything that mattered. This was something different. This was contempt that had acquired a new ingredient, and that ingredient was worry. "Thank you for your concern," Lyra said pleasantly. She walked away before Cassiel could respond, which was in itself a kind of revolution. She found Sable that afternoon near the East Wing, the part of the house where the Alpha King's delegation had been given quarters, and she did not stop to second-guess herself before she spoke. "The Serpent bowed," she said, "but my wolf has never emerged. I am 19 years old, and I have never shifted. What does that mean for the bloodline claim?" Sable looked at her with an expression that suggested this question had been anticipated. "It means the line went dormant very early, likely as a survival mechanism if your parents were hunted or in danger. The wolf and the powers do not disappear, but they hide, and they hide in ways that can last for generations. The fact that the Serpent recognized you despite the dormancy suggests the core is intact. When the wolf wakes, it will be as though it never slept." She paused. "The king has requested a blood ceremony. It is an old ritual, largely unused, that can confirm or deny a bloodline claim without requiring the wolf to surface. He will present it as optional, but in practice the weight of tonight's recognition means that if you refuse, it will look like you have something to hide." Lyra absorbed this. "When?" 3 days, Sable said. "At the new moon. It is the correct astronomical timing for the ritual, and it gives the other evaluations time to conclude." 3 days was enough time for many things to happen, and they did. She was given proper accommodations without being asked, which she attributed to the Alpha King's practical nature, and not to any softness on anyone's part. She was given access to the estate library, which she had always been forbidden from entering on the grounds that servants had no business with books, and she spent the better part of 2 evenings in it working through everything she could find about the Winter Sovereigns and the history that preceded the current clan structure. What she found was fragmentary, deliberately so, because history is written by the people who survive it, and the people who survived the fall of the Winter Sovereigns had very specific reasons for keeping the record incomplete. But fragments were enough for a girl who had spent years learning to read between what was said and what was meant. The Winter Sovereigns had not simply been rulers. They had been bound to the land itself, their power drawn from and returned to something older than any pack structure, a connection to the elemental forces that the northern territories were built upon. Ice was their medium. Cold was their instrument. The Serpent had been made from the heart of a glacier that had existed since before human memory, and it had been bound to their blood not as a symbol, but as a living record of what they carried. Cassiel, meanwhile, moved through those. 3 days with the focused efficiency of someone who had concluded that the situation required escalation. Lyra was aware of this in the peripheral way she was always aware of threats, through the quality of the looks she received from Cassiel's allies among the clan daughters, through the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, through the sense of coordinated activity happening just outside her field of vision. She did not know what Cassiel was planning. She knew that it would be sophisticated, and that it would be aimed at the blood ceremony, and she knew that when it arrived, she would be expected to handle it without any of the resources that Cassiel had been accumulating for years. On the second evening, she encountered the Alpha King unexpectedly in the corridor outside the library. He was alone, which she had not seen before, and he was carrying what appeared to be a territorial map rolled under one arm, which suggested he had been working and not simply walking. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. It was a very narrow corridor. "You have been using the library," he said. Not accusatory. Observational. "Yes," she said. "I hope that was not overstepping." He made a sound that was not quite dismissal of her concern. "It is your heritage you are reading about. It seems appropriate." He paused in the way she was learning. He paused with intention, and not from lack of words. "What have you found?" She told him, concisely and honestly, because concision and honesty were the two currencies she had consistently available. He listened the way he had listened in the garden, with that complete attention that she was beginning to understand was one of his genuine qualities and not a performance. "The connection to the land concerns the current clan leaders," he said when she had finished. "They know that if the Winter Sovereign line resurfaces with a full claim, the territorial arrangements of the last 4 centuries are negotiable, in ways they have preferred to consider settled." He looked at her with those pale eyes in the low light of the corridor. "You should know that your claim, if verified, will make you valuable and will make you a target. Not only from within this estate." She met his gaze. "How long have you known that was a possibility?" He did not look away. "I have known for 6 months that the Serpent might respond to someone at this gathering," he said. "I did not know it would be you specifically. I did not know it would be this specific." There was something in the last sentence that she chose not to examine too closely, because examining it felt dangerous in a way she did not have vocabulary for yet. She nodded and stepped aside to let him pass, and stood in the corridor after he had gone, breathing carefully, thinking about the particular weight of what was not being said by a man who appeared to say very little. The night before the blood ceremony, she could not sleep, which was not a surprise. And she went to the garden, which was also not a surprise, because the garden was where she went when the world required processing, and had always been where she went, even when she was going there with a broom and a bucket, instead of simply her own anxious thoughts. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars above were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to the particular complications of what was happening below them. She was sitting on the edge of the fountain, the one she had cleaned 3 days ago, when she heard footsteps that were too deliberate to be a guard's routine pattern, and too light to belong to one of the 12 enormous men who formed the Alpha King's retinue. She turned, and found Cassiel walking toward her from the garden's east entrance, and Cassiel was not alone. There were 2 women with her, daughters of allied clans whom Lyra recognized distantly as having arrived with resources and connections and the specific kind of ambition that attached itself to whoever seemed most likely to succeed. They were not carrying anything visible. They did not need to be. "I have been thinking," Cassiel said, settling herself on the garden bench across from Lyra with the ease of someone taking a seat in her own parlor, "about the blood ceremony." She looked at Lyra with something that had shifted past contempt into something more complicated, something that was almost respect, mixed with the specific hatred that respect can generate when it arrives against your will. "I have also been thinking about what happens if it confirms your claim, and I have concluded that this cannot be permitted to happen." Lyra waited. "The blood ceremony requires a voluntary participant," Cassiel said. "The participant must enter it without compulsion. If you were to find yourself unwell tomorrow morning, unable to participate, the ceremony would be postponed. If it were postponed long enough, certain political arrangements could be made that would make the question of your bloodline considerably less relevant regardless of what the ceremony found." She paused. "I am offering you a choice. You can cooperate with the postponement, in which case we can find a comfortable arrangement for you, something better than what you have had, a position, a small independence, resources you have never had access to. Or—" She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Lyra looked at her for a long moment in the cold night under the indifferent stars. She thought about what she had read in the library. She thought about what Sable had told her, and what the Alpha King had said in the corridor. She thought about 19 years of smallness, of learning to be invisible, of believing that invisibility was her only viable strategy in a world that had never indicated it had space for her. Then she thought about the Serpent bowing. "No," she said. It was a small word, but she said it with the entirety of what she was. No. Cassiel's expression did not change, which was itself an answer. She stood, smoothed the skirt of her dress, and walked back the way she had come. The two women followed. Lyra sat alone by the fountain in the cold, and something in the air around her changed temperature, very slightly, in a direction that was not warmer. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The blood ceremony took place in the estate's oldest room, a stone chamber beneath. The main hall that predated the current structure by several hundred years, and smelled of cold and age and something mineral that Lyra could not name, but that her body recognized in a way her mind had not caught up to yet. The Alpha King was there, and Sable, and 3 elder wolves of his retinue, whose combined age probably exceeded the estate above them, and every clan leader whose territory abutted the Ashvale lands. Because the political implications of this ceremony were significant enough that the witnesses needed to be beyond dispute. Cassiel was there too, positioned near the back with the composed grace of someone who has accepted that a battle cannot be avoided and has decided to watch for the openings. She looked at Lyra once when Lyra entered the chamber, a single measured look that contained a warning and a promise, and something underneath both of those that Lyra read as genuine fear, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen on Cassiel's face. The ceremony itself was ancient and simple, the way truly old things tend to be, stripped of the elaborations that later generations add when they are trying to make up for understanding less than they pretend. One of the elder wolves drew a precise line across Lyra's palm with an instrument that was older than anything she could estimate, and a single drop of her blood fell to the stone floor of the chamber, and then the room filled with cold. Not a cold that arrived from outside, a cold that arose from within, from the stone itself, from the air itself, from some place that was not locatable with human senses, but was entirely perceivable to every supernatural creature in the room. The serpent was not present, physically, but something of what it was, something of what it represented, answered from across the estate, as though walls and distance meant nothing to it. The stone beneath Lyra's feet glowed with a faint pale light that was unmistakably the color of glacial ice, and one of the elder wolves made a sound, low and involuntary, that was nothing like his ordinary voice. He looked at her, and then he looked at the Alpha King, and he said, in the deliberate tones of someone reporting a fact that is going to change many other facts, "The line is direct. She is not a descendant of the Winter Sovereigns. She is the heir." What happened after that happened quickly and then slowly, the way significant things tend to happen. A rush of immediate consequence, and then the long work of living with Ina. The elder wolves conferred in voices too low for anyone but the Alpha King to hear. And the Alpha King listened, and then said something in return, in a voice equally quiet and considerably more final. The clan leaders who had come as witnesses were required to acknowledge what they had seen, which several of them did with visible reluctance, and one of them with what appeared to be genuine terror, because the political world they had been managing for 40 years had just developed a complication they had absolutely not prepared for. Cassiel stood in her place at the back of the chamber and did not move and did not speak, and the quality of her stillness had changed completely from what it had been before. The composed stillness of a strategist had become the stillness of someone who has received information that has not yet been processed into action. She looked at Lyra once more before she looked away, and what Lyra saw in her eyes in that moment was not hatred, and it was not fear, and it was not even the complicated respect she had glimpsed the night before. It was something that looked almost like grief, and Lyra, who had spent years invisible to this woman, found that she did not know what to do with that. The Alpha King came to stand beside her after the chamber had partially cleared, when the witnesses had filed out to begin the process of communicating what they had seen to everyone who mattered, and Sable had tactfully moved to the far side of the room to consult with the elders, and Lyra was standing with her bandaged hand held at her side, looking at the faint traces of light that were still visible in the stone at her feet, fading now, but not entirely gone. "You are not afraid," he said. She considered this. "I am terrified," she said. "But I have been afraid for most of my life, and it has not generally been useful. So I have learned to continue regardless." She heard him inhale, very slowly, and exhale. When she looked up at him, his face was doing something that she had not seen it do before. Not quite an expression. More like the moment just before an expression, when a feeling has reached the surface and has not yet decided how to present itself. "I would like to show you something," he said. "If you will come with me." She nodded and followed him up out of the chamber, and through the estate, and out through the north entrance she had never used because it led to the forest, and the servants were not permitted in the forest, and into the cold night air that met her skin like a greeting she had not known she was waiting for. He took her to the edge of the northern wood, where the old trees were enormous, and the ground was carpeted in frost, and he stopped in a clearing where moonlight came through the branches in columns, and turned the frost to something luminous. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the trees, and she had the sense that he was deciding something, the way people look when they are standing at a door that cannot be unwalked through once opened. Then he said, "My pack believes I am indifferent. My advisors believe I am calculating. My enemies believe I am cruel, which is at least partially intentional because a believed cruelty prevents certain problems from arising. What none of them know is that I came here looking for something specific, and I was not certain I would find it, and I was prepared for the possibility that I would not." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, his pale eyes were silver, almost luminous, and she could see in them the thing that he was very carefully not performing. "The serpent did not surprise me as much as it surprised everyone else," he said, "because I had a reason to think it might respond. I have known about the dormant line for 6 months. I have known about this estate's connection to it for 4. I came to this gathering with information that I chose not to share because I needed to see what would happen when the recognition occurred. Naturally, uninfluenced by expectation." He paused. "What I did not account for was who you would be when I found you." She looked at him in the silver clearing. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was not going to examine it in real time. "What do you mean?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was someone who had very rarely in his life said precisely what he meant, and that this moment was one in which he was choosing to do so. "I came expecting to find a bloodline," he said. "I found a person. That is not the same thing, and it matters to me in ways that were not part of my original calculation." He looked at her steadily. "I would like, if you are willing, for you to come to the north, not as a political acquisition, not as a managed heir. I would like you to come and learn what you carry and what it means, and I would like to know you better, and I would like you to have the option of deciding for yourself what to do with all of it without being told by people whose interest is in managing you rather than serving you." She was quiet for a moment. The frost around her feet had begun to glow, very faintly, in a way that she noticed with peripheral awareness, and chose to file away for later consideration. "You are still evaluating candidates," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said simply. "I am not." That night changed things in ways that required days to fully surface. Lyra slept properly for the first time since her arrival in the upper guest room, which was something she noticed with the part of her mind that tracked practical information, and woke before dawn with a clarity that was new. The clarity that comes when you have made a decision without fully articulating it yet, but your body has understood and adjusted accordingly. She went to the library again, not frantically as she had before, but steadily. And she spent the morning reading about the North, about the Drakkar territories, about what the Alpha King's domain looked like, and what it required, and what she might be walking into, if she agreed to what he had offered. She was reading when Sable found her again, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern, that Sable found people rather than waiting to be found. Cassiel spoke with the king this morning, Sable said, sitting in the adjacent chair with the casual authority she brought to every piece of furniture she encountered. She withdrew her candidacy. Lyra looked up. She withdrew. She requested a private conversation with him at dawn and spoke for approximately 40 minutes and left the conversation looking like someone who has done a thing they cannot undo and has made their peace with it. Sable looked at her thoughtfully. The king did not share the content of the conversation. He did, however, come out of it looking like a man who has resolved something he had been carrying for longer than comfortable. Lyra set down the book she had been holding. What was between them? She asked, because it was the question she had been not asking since the garden encounter and Cassiel's flash of grief. Sable was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested she was deciding how much context to provide. He turned her down 4 years ago, she said at last. Not cruelly, but completely. She had approached him with a formal interest claim, and he had been honest with her, which was perhaps more painful than cruelty would have been. She spent the 4 years since then convincing herself that she had simply not had the right opportunity and that this gathering would correct it. She paused. She is not a simple villain. She is a person who wanted something very much and made choices she cannot undo in the service of wanting it. The king has told her that there will be no consequences for what she attempted with you last night because he is, in these particular matters, more merciful than his reputation suggests. She is returning to her clan. Lyra sat with this for a moment. Outside the library window, the grounds of the estate were going about their morning with the indifference of places that do not register the significance of what happens within them. She could have simply said hello to me, Lyra said. At any point in the 19 years we shared this house, she could have simply acknowledged that I existed. Sable looked at her with something quiet in her expression. Yes, she said. She could have. The formal announcement that the Alpha King had concluded his evaluation and made his selection was delivered in the estate's great hall 3 days later, with the full assembly of clan representatives and the Serpent gleaming silently in its corner and the light falling through the high windows in columns that turned the assembled crowd into something that looked almost like a painting of itself. Lyra stood where she had stood at the beginning of all of this, near the pillar at the back where the light did not quite reach, except that she was not hiding this time. She was simply standing there, wearing a dress that Sable had quietly arranged for her, dark blue and simply cut, but clearly not the dress of someone who swept floors, and she was watching the room with the particular quality of attention that she had spent 19 years developing, and that she was beginning to understand was one of her actual gifts, the ability to see what was happening underneath what appeared to be happening. The Alpha King stood at the front of the hall beside his 12 guards, and he looked exactly as he had looked on the first night, utterly himself, making no concessions to the weight of the occasion, because the occasion was not heavier than he was. He said what needed to be said in clear and direct terms, the blood ceremony and its result, the formal recognition of the dormant Winter Sovereign line, his intention to bring the heir of that line to the north under his personal protection, while she came into her inheritance and her power. He said it without ornamentation or apology, and the clan leaders in the front rows received it with various degrees of acceptance and resistance and concealed alarm, all of which he clearly had anticipated and had decided he did not require their approval for. Then he looked toward the back of the hall, past all the people in front of him, directly to where Lyra was standing by the pillar in the not-quite light, and he said, at a volume that carried easily through the entire room, if she is willing. The thing about being invisible for 19 years is that it teaches you the precise value of being seen. It is not comfortable, being seen. It does not feel the way the stories suggest it feels. It feels exposed and terrifying, and also, underneath the terror, like breathing deeply for the first time in years. Like your lungs discovering they have been working with less capacity than they were built for and correcting for it. Like something returning that you had not known was lost. Lyra walked out from behind the pillar. She walked the length of the hall with every eye in the room on her, which was the thing she had spent most of her life preventing, and she was afraid, and she walked anyway, because this was what it looked like to stop surrendering. She stopped before him, close enough now to see the precise quality of stillness in those pale eyes, the thing behind them that was not cold at all, but had simply been protecting itself. And she said, "I am willing." He held her gaze for a moment that contained more than either of them had yet put into words. And then he did something she had not seen him do in all the days she had been observing him. He offered her his hand. Not a gesture of possession, not a claim. An offer. She took it, and the hall was very still, and somewhere in the corner, the Serpent of Ashvale stirred in its ancient ice, and its pale light brightened, and everyone in the room felt it. That sensation of something that had been waiting a very long time finally arriving at its destination. The days that followed the announcement were practical and busy in ways that did not leave much room for the enormity of what had happened to surface, which Lyra suspected was partly intentional, partly the natural momentum of logistics, and partly the character of the man whose household she was now associated with, who dealt with significant things by moving through them rather than standing still in them. She was given a formal attendant, a young woman named Petra, who was shy and efficient and clearly uncertain what to make of her new charge, but committed to doing her job properly regardless, which Lyra respected. She began a series of conversations with Sable about what the North would look like, what the Drakkar territories required, what her role would be in practical terms, while the longer-term questions of her bloodline and its implications were worked through by people who understood such things better than she did. She packed what she had, which was not much, and did not feel as bereft about this as she might have expected, because she had never had much, and had long since stopped defining herself by her possessions. She said goodbye to Maren, who pressed both of her hands and said nothing, and did not cry, because Maren was not a woman who cried, but whose eyes communicated everything her voice declined to carry. She did not say goodbye to Cassiel, who had left before the announcement, and was therefore not present to say goodbye to. And she thought about what she might have said if the opportunity had existed, and she thought perhaps she would have said nothing, and perhaps she would have said too much, and perhaps that was why the universe had arranged for the absence. On the morning of departure, she found herself at dawn in the garden one last time, sitting by the fountain she had cleaned more times than she could count, feeling the frost on the stones around her, and noticing that the frost near her feet had taken a particular shape, branching and crystalline, more deliberate than the random patterns of ordinary cold. She was looking at it when she heard the footsteps, and this time she knew them before she turned, the precise and measured tread of a man who moved through space as though he had considered his relationship with it and concluded he was comfortable with it. He sat beside her on the stone edge of the fountain, which was not something she had expected. The deliberate choosing of the same piece of stone when the garden offered many alternatives. He looked at the crystalline frost patterns spreading from where her feet touched the ground. "It is beginning," he said. She looked down at the ice that was moving with her breath, with her presence, reaching outward in patterns that she did not consciously direct, but that felt, when she stopped analyzing, and simply felt, like breathing. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "The beginning?" "No," he said. "Sometimes the awakening is violent. Sometimes it is disorienting. What you are experiencing is rare. It is as though the power recognizes that you are ready and is behaving accordingly." He paused. "You are not afraid of it." She looked at the branching ice and thought about this honestly. I am afraid of many things, she said. But this does not feel like something being done to me. It feels like something that has always been there, and is simply becoming audible. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the warmth of him beside her, which was interesting, because warmth was not among the qualities she would have predicted for a man whose name was synonymous with the cold territories of the far north. She thought perhaps he carried his own warmth specifically because the world he inhabited offered so little of it. In the north, he said, there are ceremonies for the emergence. When a wolf that has been dormant begins to wake, we can observe them if you wish, or skip them if you do not. There is no requirement. She looked at him. You give me many choices for a king. He met her gaze, and that thing was present again behind his eyes. The warmth he kept carefully interior. The something that she was taking very careful internal note of while externally remaining composed. I am aware, he said, that choices are what you have had least of. I intend to correct that imbalance where I can. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which she was discovering was frequently the appropriate response to this man. And they sat together on the edge of the fountain in the cold dawn, while the ice branched and grew around her feet in patterns that looked almost like a language she was just beginning to learn to read. The journey north took 5 days, and the 5 days were their own kind of education. She traveled in the Alpha King's primary carriage, which was large and warm and stocked with maps and documents and the kind of practical intelligence-gathering materials that suggested the man who used it never stopped working. He worked for much of the journey, which she respected, and during the hours when the road required less attention to the documentation of territorial concerns, they talked. Not the careful conversational performances of the evaluation process, not the politically weighted exchanges of the estate's public spaces. They talked the way two people talk when the world has decided to put them in proximity for 5 days, and the usual social structures are temporarily suspended by the requirements of travel. She told him about the library, about what she had found, and what she had thought about it, and he listened, and occasionally corrected details from his own knowledge, and sometimes went quiet, in ways that meant he was actually considering what she had said, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He told her things about the North, about the specific politics of the territorial agreements, and where the fragile points were and what he was managing with the various clan interests, not in summary, but in the nuanced working detail of someone who has thought about it extensively and is accustomed to thinking about it mostly alone. She asked questions that evidently surprised him, because several times he paused before answering in a way that she interpreted as recalibration, adjusting to an interlocutor who was following more closely than he had expected. On the third evening, when the carriage was stopped for the night at a way station and the stars had emerged in the specific abundance of the territories north of the established clan lands, he said, almost without preamble, I have not talked this much in years. She looked at him. He appeared mildly surprised by his own statement. I do not say that as a complaint, he added. She looked back at the stars. Neither do I, she said. The North arrived before they did, in the way that significant places do, through changes in the quality of the light and the character of the cold and the particular texture of the land, which flattened and whitened and developed a breadth that the managed territories of the southern clans did not have, the breadth of places that have not been organized into usefulness and are the better for it. Lyra pressed her face to the carriage window like someone who had not been taught that this was undignified, and saw the first glaciers when they were still distant, and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite longing and was not quite recognition, but contained elements of both. By the time they reached the gates of the Drakkar citadel, the ice around her feet in the carriage had spread to cover the floor, and she had given up pretending not to notice it, and the Alpha King had given up pretending not to watch it with an expression that she was beginning to identify as the maximum quantity of feeling that his face permitted itself to display. The end. Citadel was everything the estate was not. It was enormous and spare, and built from the same dark stone as the mountains it had been grown from, and the cold was a presence here, in the way that warmth was a presence in places built for comfort, something that you move through rather than around. It was also, she discovered in the first hours, considerably more alive than its exterior suggested. The people of the Drakkar household worked with the efficiency of those who understand that their environment requires constant management and have made their peace with this, and they greeted the Alpha King's return with the specific kind of respect that is given to someone who has actually earned it, which is different in quality from the respect given to inherited power, warmer and more personal. They looked at her with curiosity that was not unkind, and she looked back with the steadiness she had learned in harder circumstances. And she thought that this place, vast and cold and requiring of her a different kind of navigation than anything she had previously managed, felt more like somewhere she could exist than the house she had spent 19 years in. Sable arrived 2 days after them, having traveled separately to manage the political communications that the announcement had generated, which were extensive. She convened a briefing in the Citadel's strategy room that included Lyra, the Alpha King, and 3 of his most senior advisors, and she laid out the landscape of response clearly and without softening it. Several of the major clan leaders had sent formal inquiries requesting clarification of what the blood ceremony had found and what the legal implications were. 2 had sent what were technically inquiries and were technically threats, distinguishable from actual threats, primarily by the diplomatic formality of the language used. 1, the most powerful of the Eastern clan leaders, had sent what appeared to be a genuine expression of interest in re-establishing the historical relationship between the Eastern clans and the Winter Sovereign line, which was interesting because it was the first positive response, and also because it implied this particular leader had been doing historical research that not everyone had access to. The Alpha King took all of this in with the focused calm of someone who had anticipated the approximate shape of it, and was now working with the specifics. He looked at the Eastern clan leader's communication for a longer moment than he gave the others. "Arrange a meeting," he said. Then he looked at Lyra. "You should be present for it." She was aware of the significance of that, of the shift from her being protected, and managed to her being included. And she was aware of something warm moving through her chest that she was increasingly having difficulty attributing to anything other than what it actually was. "I will be there," she said. The weeks that followed were the most extraordinary, and also the most mundane of Lyra's life, which is itself a kind of extraordinary. She worked, which was something she was good at, and which the Alpha King's household offered in abundance, and which gave her a framework for the larger dislocation of her circumstances. She studied the North with the same focused attention she had brought to the library at Asheville, reading territorial histories and climate records and pack structures, with the growing sense that she was reading about something she was supposed to have known from birth and was now catching up to. She worked with Sable on the political communications, drafting language that was careful and clear, and neither aggressive nor apologetic, because she was learning that her bloodline was a negotiating position, and that negotiating positions were most effective when held from genuine confidence rather than performed confidence. She began, tentatively, to let the ice do what it wanted to do, which was mostly to exist more extensively than ordinary ice did, to branch across surfaces in patterns that she was beginning to read the way she read text, as a kind of externalized thought process that the power used to show itself. It was strange. It was also, she was discovering, something she had less desire to suppress than she had initially expected. She had spent a long time making herself smaller. Making herself colder was, against all expectations, a relief. The Alpha King watched all of this. She was aware of being watched, not with the surveillance quality of the estate or the assessment quality of the evaluation, but with the attention of someone who is interested in what they are watching and is not hiding that interest as carefully as they probably should be. He found reasons to be in the same rooms she was in, which she was choosing to attribute to the operational requirements of running a territory, rather than any personal motivation, because personal motivation felt too large to look at directly yet. He asked her, Opinion on things, not rhetorically, but actually, waiting for the answers with the patience of someone who expects the answers to be useful, and they frequently were, because Lyra had spent 19 years observing from positions where people forgot she could hear them, and had consequently developed a perspective on human behavior that was both broad and precise. She found herself saying things she had not known she was going to say until she was saying them, because he listened in a way that made honesty feel like the obvious choice. One evening, in the strategy room after the Eastern Clan meeting had concluded successfully, and the advisors had filed out, and the maps on the table were still open to the territories they had been discussing, she said, without particularly planning to, "You are not what I expected." He looked at her from across the table. "What did you expect?" She considered. "Someone who used power as a substitute for warmth," she said. "Someone who had made himself formidable as a way of not having to be vulnerable." She paused. "You are formidable, but it is not a substitute." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was actually thinking about what she had said. "And you," he said, "are not what the Serpent prepared me for. I expected someone shaped by their bloodline. I found someone shaped by their choices. That is more interesting." He held her gaze across the maps for a moment longer than the conversation required, and then he looked back, down at the territories, and she looked back down at the territories, and neither of them said anything else. But the room had changed temperature, very slightly, in a direction that was not colder. The wolf came on a night in late winter, when the aurora was visible from the citadel's northern ramparts, and the cold was the deep and serious kind that the north produced several times a year, the kind that felt like the land reminding you of its actual nature beneath whatever temporary accommodations it had made for human habitation. She had gone to the ramparts because she could not sleep, and because the aurora was the most extravagant and inexplicable thing this landscape regularly produced, and she had not yet exhausted her astonishment at it. She was standing at the wall looking at the colors when it happened, not gradually as Sable had suggested it might, not with warning or ceremony, but in a single complete moment, like a door opening. The cold that she had been letting exist outside her went internal, and the ice that had been branching along surfaces turned and branched inside her instead, through channels she had not known she had, but that fit perfectly, the way a key fits a lock that has been waiting for it. She did not fall. She gripped the wall, and the wall grew ice under her fingers, and she breathed very carefully, and the cold moved through her like a river finding its course, unstoppable, but also, she realized, not destructive, not trying to overwhelm. Her, working with her, understanding her as a context. Then the wolf, enormous and pale and silver-white, the color of the aurora above them, was suddenly simply present in a way she could not describe, because it was not a rival. It was more like recognition. The wolf had always been there, and she was now able to see it, standing somewhere that was and was not her body, regarding her with the calm of something that has been patient for 19 years and has run out of reasons to wait. They looked at each other, she and the wolf, and then they looked together at the aurora, and the wolf lowered its great head, and she understood what this meant, and she was not afraid. She was still standing at the wall, not shifted, not yet ready to do that particular thing yet, but knowing she could. When she heard him behind her, she did not turn. She heard him stop a few feet away, and she heard him register what had happened in the quality of the silence that followed his stopping. And then she heard him take a breath that was not quite steady. "When?" he said. "A few minutes ago," she said. She turned to face him. He was in the plain clothes he wore when he was not performing the role of Alpha King, and his pale eyes in the aurora light were the same color as her wolf, which she noticed and which she thought perhaps she was supposed to notice. He looked at her for a long moment, and all the controlled space between the emotion and the expression was very close to collapsing. She could see it happening the way she could see ice reaching the surface of water. "Come here," he said. And it was the same 2 words he had said in the hall at Asheville, but with everything different about them. Not a command this time, but a request. And she walked across the stones of the rampart and stopped in front of him. And then he said, quietly, with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about every word, "I did not come to Asheville looking for a political solution. I came looking for the Winter Sovereign line, because 6 months ago I found a text that described the line's power in specific terms, and it matched something I had been looking for without quite knowing what I was looking for. I found you. I did not expect to find you, and I did not expect what finding you would produce in me, and I have been attempting to be responsible about it because your circumstances were complicated, and I did not want to be another person using your situation for their own ends." He stopped. He looked at her with everything unguarded. "I am telling you this because I think you have the right to know it, and because the wolf has woken, and the power is yours, and you are no longer in a position where honesty from me could be mistaken for leverage." She looked at him. She thought about 19 years of learning to read what was underneath what was said, of learning the difference between what people offered and what they meant, of learning that the safest assumption was always the ungenerous one. She looked at him, and she set that knowledge aside. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." Something in his face completed its journey to the surface. He lifted his hand, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who is not accustomed to gestures and is committing to this one fully, and he touched her face, and the ice that rose from his hand where it met her skin was the same pale color as everything she was learning to be, and she thought that this was what belonging felt like. Not a place, not a name, not a ceremony or a bloodline or a serpent bowing in a hall, but this specific and particular recognition, this being seen completely and remaining. The formal claiming ceremony, which was both a wolf-bonding ritual and a political event of considerable significance, took place 6 weeks later, at the winter solstice, when the north was at its most completely itself, all ice and dark, and the austere beauty of a landscape that had never tried to make itself comfortable for anything. It was attended by representatives of every major territory, and by the Eastern clan leader, who had sent the positive response, and who turned out to be a woman of approximately Sable's age, with a long memory and a detailed knowledge of Winter Sovereign history that suggested she had been waiting for this for decades, and was extremely pleased to have the wait concluded. The ceremony itself was conducted by the eldest of the Drakkar elders, a man so old that the age had become something else in him, something that no longer registered as a disadvantage, and it proceeded in the old language that Lyra had been learning for 6 weeks with the focused intensity she brought to anything that mattered. She understood enough of it to know when she was being asked to affirm, and when she was being asked to accept, and when she was being asked to claim in return, which was the part no one had described to her in advance, and which turned out to involve a response in the old language that she had been coached for but not told the occasion for. And she looked at the man beside her who was going to be her mate and her king, and she said the words directly to him rather than to the assembled witnesses, because they were meant for him, and he received them the way he received everything important, with complete attention and something warm moving through the pale of his eyes. The ice came during the ceremony without being called. It came from the ground and the walls and the air itself, because the North recognized what was happening and had its own way of marking it, and the patterns it made across the floor of the ceremonial hall were the same patterns she had begun to read in the weeks of her awakening, complex and geometrically perfect and warm in the way that only cold things can be warm when they are exactly what they are supposed to be. The Serpent of Asheville was not present. She had asked if it could be brought and been told that it was bound to the estate and could not be moved. But she felt it from the distance as something continuous, a low and steady recognition that had begun the night it bowed and had not stopped, a frequency she was learning to carry as part of herself, the way you carry the sound of your own blood, moving through your veins, always there, available when you listen for it. She stood beside him, and she was claimed, and she claimed in return, and the North recognized it with ice that sang in frequencies below hearing, and the political structure of the territories shifted into a new arrangement that none of them yet had complete language for, but that everyone in the room understood was more stable than what it had replaced, because it was built on something that had waited 400 years to be found, and was therefore not going to be easily dislodged. She looked at her wolf through the interior window that the awakening had opened, and her wolf looked back at her with the patience of something that has always known how this ends. And she looked at the man beside her, at everything that was visible in him, now that the calculation had stopped being necessary. And she thought about the girl who had hidden behind a pillar in a hall, and believed that invisibility was survival. She thought about what she would tell that girl if she could. She thought perhaps she would tell her that the thing she was hiding from was not as frightening as the thing she was hiding, and that the world was going to need her to be visible eventually, and that when it finally happened, it would feel like what it actually was. Not exposure, but emergence. The terrifying and necessary and entirely worth it act of becoming what you were always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? She stood in the Citadel's northern garden on the first morning of spring, which arrived in the north with the subtlety of a rumor. Rather than the declaration it made in more temperate places, a slight change in the quality of the light, a degree of temperature that made the cold feel different, transitional rather than permanent. The garden had no flowers yet. It would not have flowers for another month, but the frost patterns across its stones were extraordinary, branching and intricate, and clearly not random, and she traced the edges of them with one foot and watched them extend in response to her presence with the ease of something that had stopped being strange and become simply part of the landscape of herself. She heard him come through the garden gate behind her, heard the gate, heard his footsteps, heard him stop when he saw what she was doing, and the small sound he made that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. The sound she was learning was the closest his body came to delight when his face was not committing to it fully. She did not turn. "It is getting stronger," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He came to stand beside her, and they looked at the patterns together. His hand found hers without commentary, without the deliberateness of the rampart or the ceremony, simply as a fact. And she let her fingers close around his, and felt the warmth of it moving against the ice she carried everywhere now, and thought that this was what they were to each other, not a correction for anything, not a remedy for anything that had been wrong, but a genuine and entire meeting, warmth and cold and the space where they existed together, which was neither, and was both, and was completely their own. The north stretched around them in every direction, vast and cold and entirely real, and somewhere in the stones beneath them, the deep frequency of something ancient and recognized hummed its continuous quiet note, and the ice around her feet branched outward in the language she was learning to read, and she read in it the word she had been waiting 19 years to encounter in any form at all, which was simply, completely, and at long last, home.